Hello and welcome to another modelling video. Today we're going to start our airbrush series, learning how to airbrush from absolute scratch, and particularly today we're going to cover paint. Now this is more or less a semi-chemistry, mostly theory lesson. I'm not going to make it boring whatsoever, and it's going to keep completely relevant to scale modelling. So let's hit the whiteboard and check it out. As we already know, there are many different types of paints, and a lot of people are confused what paint's compatible with what thinner or what paint's appropriate for what job. We're going to look at the basic makeup of paint. The components to paint is pigment, binder or vehicle, solvent and additives. The pigment is a solid matter, and it normally dictates exactly what colour it is or if it's metallic. Sometimes the pigment's not even present in things like your top coats and your inks or clear colours. Your binder or vehicle is what is your paint made out of, and most of the time it's some sort of resin, being a acrylic based one or an oil based one. Your solvent, which is very important, is what keeps your paint fresh and in liquid form, and how it cures once either chemically exposed or exposed to air and dries. And your additives, which are in very small amounts but makes large differences to your paint, such as stabilizers or retardants, which make your paint dry a lot longer. This is very important for the care you keep for your paint, because we know there's a solid matter and many incompatible chemicals. We know over time it can separate, and it does require to be mixed with something fine like a toothpick or a 9-inch nail. We also know that paint can dry when something stimulates it, so you need to keep your jars more or less tight, and ideal try not to chemically modify them by adding thinner before you add to the jar. Paint only has one purpose, and that's to statically look nice and pleasing. Generally change the colour of an object, but that doesn't always work out. Sometimes the paint can't stick to the surface, or the paint is quite fragile, or you lay something over the paint and that's quite fragile and it needs protection or grip, or you want a very particular effect mixed into the paint. We'll look at different purposes of paints. You guys might already know about some of these, but primer, more or less it's a neutral colour, grey or white. Most of the time with paint or pigment builds up on surfaces, and sometimes it's transparent. So what's underneath the paint, or the colour underneath the paint, can actually dictate the effect of the paint. So sometimes it's good to have a universal colour throughout the entire model, which is what primer does. Secondly, sometimes paint doesn't have a nature to stick to certain objects. Primer has not only just pigment, but a small gritty sand-like texture in it, and more or less a very strong solvent, so most of the time they're lacquer. And this lacquer will make these little fine sand grit pigments stick to a surface like a powder coat, and then the paint can actually stick onto that. So more or less it's like the glue between the paint and the surface. Ink and washes normally don't have a pigment. It's extremely transparent. So since they're so runny, they can't actually layer across the surface and gather at corners, which make detail. That's ideal for our hobby. Top coat and varnishes, more or less they only have a vehicle and no pigments, so there's nothing to them. You can see right through them. They're to go over a paint job or whatever else is on your paint job, like panel marking effects or decals, and generally give it protection. On top of that, you can also dictate the finish. We'll cover finishes next. And paint effects. You've got your flat colours, but also with your pigments you can actually put metallic pigments and give a metallic finish, or you can actually have an luminous finish where it glows in the dark. That can be added to the actual pigment or pearlescent. Effect paint, normally pigments are a lot bigger than your standard flat colours, so they require more watering down and sometimes give a little problem through an airbrush. Let's say this is our surface, this is our paint. Now, since the binder is a resin, resin is always glossy in nature. And you have your pigments. And these pigments are dense enough so you do not see the colour of this surface, you see whatever the colour is that. If the pigment density is very, very low, let's say like in clear paint, the density will be quite low and you can still see behind it and what that colour is. Though since it's quite dense, it is a completely solid different colour. Though since the resin is on top of the pigments, it is going to be glossy in nature. If we're going to have matte paint, we'll have the resin here, and you'll actually have pigments sticking on top, inside and below of the resin. So that means the resin effect is not actually on top of the pigment. So the pigment is covering the gloss. And that's the difference between your matte and gloss. Now you might have heard stories that there is a matte finish or a matte varnish. Now with this matte varnish, all it is a pigment that's frost in nature. So it's a see-through pigment. When you're applying it, it also has a resin, so there's a second coat of resin on top, and you've got a very fine density of these see-through pigments. So now you have a matte coat over a gloss finish. Though, as you know, if you apply too much matte coat, or if the matte coat is extremely thick, this densifies and you will not be able to see this colour anymore. And since it's frosty in nature, you'll only see white frost. Always apply your matte coat as thin as possible in as many coats as you need to, and make sure each coat dries so you see where the density is at, if there's any gloss left over or if the gloss has been completely eliminated. Now we're going to see what different paints are made out of via their binder and the solvent that they act to. Chemically knowing what they act to is very important, as we need to know what thinner is used to make these paints able to go through an airbrush, an atomizer of air, and apply it to a surface. And also what chemicals are needed to clean these paints up, because the chemicals are not compatible with each other. So far, solvent based, we've got water based. That's not applicable to us because it doesn't water down too well, it doesn't atomize in the brush. Though it's particularly very good for hand painting, particularly figures. Though I've never really liked using them on Gundam kits. We've got acrylics, that's what's made. Citadel, a water-based paint example, normally used for painting metal figures for wargaming. We've got acrylics, that's what's mostly used out there. It thins down with isotopic alcohol, or Tamiya makes a brand of thinner for it. And when you're cleaning after, you can use methylated spirits. With acrylics, the Aquarius Goons brand of paint and the Tamiya XF line are excellent examples. I find practically all acrylic paints thin very well with X20A by Tamiya, and cleans up perfectly fine with just general purpose methylated spirits found in supermarkets.